This is Twit.
The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, plans to propose today new rules for internet service providers that critics say would end net neutrality in the United States. His proposal would allow content providers to pay ISPs for superior connections for that last-mile connectivity to homes and businesses. Yet he defends the move, saying that they preserve net neutrality. Before I introduce our interview guest on this topic today, let's hear what presidential candidate Barack Obama promised in November 2007, speaking at Google's Silicon Valley headquarters.
I intend to work with you to write the next chapter in the story of American innovation. That's part of the reason why I'm running for president of the United States. To seize this moment, we have to ensure free and full exchange of information. And that starts with an open internet. I will take a backseat to no one in my commitment to network neutrality. Because once providers start to privilege some applications or websites over others, then the smaller voices get squeezed out and we all lose. The internet is perhaps the most open network in history, and we have to keep it that way.
Well, I certainly agree with that. With us to discuss this topic is Jason Abruzzi, reporter for Mashable. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks very much.
Now, can you give us a little background on how we got to where we are today? I mean, as I understand it, the United States had a functioning system for protecting net neutrality. Why are the rules for net neutrality being rewritten at this point?
Well, not too long ago, a court of appeals struck down our net neutrality rules that the FCC had written, saying that they went too far and were essentially, just gave too much power to the FCC. They were told to rewrite the rules, and that if they were, resubmitted, that they could end up guaranteeing an open internet, what people know as net neutrality. What's being proposed today within the FCC is the newest version of those rules that they're hoping will stay within the law while also maintaining an open internet.
Now, this is a fairly complex issue when you get into the details, and there was a lot of news around Netflix and Comcast talking about peering arrangements. Now, what that's about is a point of origin for content, such as Netflix, connecting to the company like Comcast that's going to provide connectivity to end users. And that connection between the content origin and the internet service provider is something that is subject to things called peering agreements, where companies like Netflix can pay Comcast for faster connections. Those connections have to be paid for by somebody at some point. What we're talking about here today is what happens after Comcast, between Comcast and the end user, and that's where the rubber meets the road is in terms of net neutrality. The confusing thing about this news is that is the degree to which Tom Wheeler is saying that despite the fact that he's proposing the legality of companies to pay the internet service providers for better connectivity, essentially, while those who don't pay don't get better connectivity, he's saying that it still preserves net neutrality. Can you explain his position?
So it's important to remember that this is a type of regulation, what is being proposed, and that's one of the reasons that the court initially struck it down. What these new rules will propose is very similar to what the old rules had enforced, which includes the fact that you're not allowed to block anybody. So if there's a legal website, there's no way, or an ISP is not legally allowed to block anybody. So you can't require people to pay for access. There's a guaranteed minimum level of access for any website that wants to operate, whether it's a startup that you have out of your garage, or if it's Netflix or ESPN.
So here's the part that really bugs me about this. I mean, that's part of what he says makes this fair and preserving of net neutrality, which is what you just said. And in addition to that, there's a process for, if there's some unfairness, somebody can, appeal it or whatever, probably in the courts. What bugs me about this is that internet service providers now have an incentive under these rules, it seems to me, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, if you get paid when people provide you with a faster, better, more reliable connection, you have an incentive now to provide everybody else with a less reliable connection, right? Because you want to incentivize your customers to upgrade. It's like a freemium model almost. So under net neutrality, if you're trying to compete with other companies to provide unfettered access, really good connections to other to high-speed content, such as coming from YouTube or Netflix or whatever, then you have an incentive to boost the performance of your network for everybody under net neutrality. Under these rules, it seems like that incentive is gone. You have an incentive to provide good connections for those who pay, and you have an incentive to provide bad connections for those who don't pay. Am I misreading this?
No, and that is one of the biggest concerns that people have about these new rules, is that the way in which they are written is not going to incentivize companies to invest broadly in their infrastructure, and that they will really only invest in areas that they find profitable. Under this model, you could theoretically say that only times where one company is going to pay for a better connection with us is a place that we're going to invest. It's also important to remember that at the same time, the FCC is trying to make sure that they use this phrase, and you're going to hear it a lot in the future, commercially reasonable. Remember that phrase, you're going to hear it all the time, because that's the key phrase here. The FCC is saying that any agreement that two companies come to, whether it's Comcast and Netflix, Time Warner Cable and Amazon, it has to be quote unquote commercially reasonable. That's going to be their test to make sure that any agreement they find doesn't harm the open internet, and also make sure to incentivize that companies invest in their infrastructure and improve the internet going forward.
Now, Jason, I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit here and ask about, I think GigaOM wrote a counterpoint sort of saying that there are a lot of sites that don't require high streaming, high broadband to get their pages and their websites delivered. So in some ways, if you're not delivering video content, intensive graphics, things like this, maybe you don't need to pay for this high specialized service. Maybe it's actually in some smaller players' benefit to keep their pages optimized to be streamed over low quality broadband. What do you make of that?
We hope that that's how it turns out. That would be really the ideal scenario, in that this agreement basically means that companies are able to sign agreements that provide better service while providing a minimum level of service that any website that really needs to operate on a simple level will be able to have without paying any sort of fee. There's a lot of paranoia that companies are not going to pursue that course, and that what you're going to end up with is very poor service for even the most basic website, while other companies, prosper because they have the money to pay those fees.
Now, I also wanted to ask, is there any way that users will have sort of visibility into who's getting specialized treatment and who isn't?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So there's two parts to that answer. One is that transparency is going to be a big part of this. That was in the part of the original open internet rules, and the FCC says it's going to be enhanced by this new ruling. So hopefully we'll gain greater insight into how companies like a Comcast, like a Time Warner Cable, like a Google Fiber handle their network loads. That will allow us to make sure that they're not, giving particular favor to certain groups.